when my wife filed for divorce. She never expected who took her place. Hello everyone, I've noticed something. Nearly 90% of people watch these videos but don't subscribe. Subscribing is completely free, and your support gives me the motivation to keep bringing you more powerful and thrilling stories. If you enjoyed this one, hit that subscribe button. Now let's get into the story. The air in our home had grown heavy long before she ever said the word divorce, though I don't think either of us wanted to admit how poisoned the silence had become. What had once been filled with small comforts, her humming in the kitchen while making coffee, the way she used to lean against the doorway when I worked late into the night, had transformed into cold routines and clipped sentences. It wasn't a sudden collapse. It was the slow erosion of intimacy, the kind that sneaks in quietly, replacing laughter with sighs, shared glances with glares, and warmth with a chill that made even the walls feel foreign. At first, I tried to excuse it as stress. Work was demanding, finances were shifting, and we both carried the fatigue of lives that felt stuck in cycles we couldn't escape. But beneath all of it, there was something sharper at play, her growing disdain. It revealed itself in the way she looked at me when I spoke, not listening but waiting for me to finish so she could puncture my words with sarcasm. It was in the way she rolled her eyes when I talked about plans, ambitions, or even simple joys, as though my voice was nothing but noise against her carefully curated life. She had started dressing differently too, putting more care into her appearance when she went out than when she was home, and though I didn't press, I noticed. I noticed everything. The dinners together became dinners apart, first with excuses, then with outright refusals, until the dining table that had once been a place of conversation became just another piece of furniture collecting dust. Nights turned into battlegrounds of unspoken grievances, and the bed between us might as well have been an ocean. She had stopped reaching for me, and I had stopped trying to bridge the distance, both of us clinging to pride like it was safer than admitting how broken we had become. I kept telling myself it was temporary, that marriages had seasons, that if I just endured the storm, the sun might return. But deep down, I knew. I knew she had already stepped out of the marriage in her heart, and I was nothing more than the shadow of the man she used to want. What I didn't know was how ruthlessly she intended to end it. It was a Thursday evening when the breaking point finally arrived, a moment so deceptively ordinary that at first I didn't register its weight. I was in the living room, half listening to the muted hum of the television, when she walked in holding a thin folder of papers. Her heels clicked against the floor, precise and deliberate, and she stood in front of me without preamble. "I filed for divorce," she said, her tone flat but her eyes glittering with something between triumph and exhaustion. The word hit me with a strange detachment, as though it had been hovering above us for so long that when it finally fell, it made no sound. I looked at her, at the perfectly composed lines of her face, at the practiced calm in her posture, and realized she had rehearsed this moment. She expected tears, arguments, maybe even begging, a performance of devastation to affirm her power, but none came. My heart clenched, yes, but there was no shock, no collapse, no desperate plea. Instead, there was a strange, almost eerie calm that settled over me. I studied her like a stranger, noting how much distance had grown between the woman she was when we first met and the one standing before me now, filing away every detail like a man memorizing a crime scene. She mistook my silence for surrender and pressed on, her voice steady, sharp, almost relieved. "It's over. You know it? We've been pretending long enough. I need more than this. More than you." The words should have gutted me, but instead they rang hollow, as though she were trying to convince herself as much as me. I nodded slowly, not trusting myself to speak yet, and her brows knitted together, irritation flickering at the edges of her composure. She wanted drama, and my calm denied it. "That's all you have to say," she snapped, her mask cracking for just a moment. I finally spoke, my voice low, controlled, deliberate. "If this is what you want, then I won't stop you." Her lips parted, caught off guard by the absence of a fight, and for a flicker of a second, doubt flashed in her eyes. She had expected a man broken. What she saw instead was a man strangely unshaken. She placed the folder on the table between us, the papers inside already stamped and signed by her hand, then turned and walked away, her heels echoing like gavel strikes in a courtroom. I sat there, staring at the folder, at the cold finality of it, and a slow realization began to take shape. This wasn't an ending. Not yet. Because the story she thought she had written, the story of her liberation and my collapse, was not the story that would unfold. The breaking point had come, yes, but the break was not mine. It was hers. And one day soon, she would see just how wrong she had been to mistake my silence for defeat. The morning after she placed that folder on the table, the house felt like a tomb. The walls carried no sound, the air itself seemed heavy, and even the light that filtered through the curtains looked gray, as though the sun refused to intrude on the wreckage of what had been declared over. She had left early, her car already gone from the driveway by the time I walked into the kitchen, but her absence didn't feel sudden. It felt inevitable, like a final stone dropped into a grave that had been dug for months. The coffee pot sat untouched, the counter barren except for the stark reminder of the manila folder she had left behind, its corners sharp against the wood of the table, its weight far heavier than its pages could explain. I sat before it staring as though it might leap to life and explain itself, but it only stared back, silent and suffocating. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I knew the contents already, the legal jargon that turned love into clauses, promises into signatures, years into property lines and bank statements. She had stripped our story into paperwork, and for all her supposed composure, the act was louder than any fight we could have had. I went through the motions of the day, but the whispers began almost immediately. Calls from mutual friends, text messages that carried the forced politeness of people pretending they hadn't heard something already. "Are you all right?" one asked. "I just heard some news. I don't know if it's true." Another prodded. By the second day, colleagues at work glanced at me differently, some with pity, some with concealed satisfaction, as if my private life had become the office's secret entertainment. The worst were the ones who pretended not to know anything at all, who smiled too warmly, who overcompensated with hollow kindness. She, meanwhile, flourished in the spectacle. I didn't see her, but I heard enough to know. She was out at dinners, laughing in public, telling anyone who would listen how she had finally freed herself from the burden of a lifeless marriage. She dressed like a woman reborn, her photos flooding social media with captions about new beginnings and choosing happiness. She wasn't subtle, but she was careful, never naming me directly, always leaving just enough ambiguity for people to fill in the blanks with their own assumptions. It worked. Soon the whispers became conclusions. She had left me because I wasn't enough, because I couldn't provide, because I was dull, stagnant, weak. They said she deserved better, that I should have seen it coming, that she had been patient with me longer than most would have tolerated. The narrative spread like wildfire, and though I moved through each day in silence, I could feel the sting of eyes on me, the smirk of those who believed they knew the truth. It would have been easier, perhaps, to lash out, to defend myself, to insist they were wrong. But I didn't. I carried myself with the same calm I had the night she said the words. And though it confused people, it also unsettled them. They wanted a man broken, a man drowning. What they got instead was a man who refused to crumble on cue. And while they whispered about my supposed weakness, I could feel something hardening inside me, something sharper than the pain of humiliation, the clarity that this was not the end of my story, but hers. If your partner walked out on you, would you take them back? Or let them live with regret? Comment below. What unsettled her most, though she would never admit it, was my refusal to perform grief the way she had expected. In her mind, she had scripted this divorce as a grand finale where she emerged triumphant, radiant, admired for her bravery, while I played the role of the abandoned, pitiful husband whose silence proved her superiority. But each time she caught wind of my composure, each time someone mentioned that I seemed fine, that I was carrying on as though nothing had broken me, her smile faltered. I knew because mutual acquaintances, the kind of people who couldn't resist delivering half-truths, would let it slip. She asked about you, they'd say casually, though their eyes lingered on me with curiosity. She seemed surprised you weren't. Devastated. The truth was I had been devastated, but devastation doesn't always look like shattered glass. Sometimes it looks like steel hardening in fire. I let her play her part, let her bask in the sympathy of those who believed her story, because I knew that sympathy is fickle and attention is hungriest when it smells blood. She had made a spectacle of leaving me, and the crowd that cheered her on would be the same one that turned when the spectacle lost its shine. In the meantime, I focused on myself in ways I hadn't in years. I started running again, the kind of long, punishing runs that left me breathless but clear-headed. I rebuilt routines, revisited goals I had abandoned, reshaped my body, my habits, my outlook. I didn't broadcast it, didn't post photos or brag about transformation. I let the silence be my shield. That silence worked like a mirror, forcing her to confront the one thing she had never prepared for, a man who didn't crumble in her absence. And in that silence, people began to grow curious. The whispers shifted ever so slightly from pity to speculation. "He doesn't look broken," they muttered. "He seems different." She noticed too. At a mutual friend's gathering weeks later, she walked in with her new glow, expecting to see me diminished, and instead found me standing taller, sharper, more present than I had been in years. Her eyes narrowed, her smile faltered for just a second. And that single flicker was enough to tell me everything. The fallout was not mine to bear. It was hers. Because while she thought she had ended my story, what she had really done was ignite a new one. And the part she had yet to understand, the part that would eventually destroy the story she told about herself, was that the person who would take her place in my life would not only surprise her, it would unravel her. The quiet strength I carried in the weeks after she filed for divorce wasn't something born overnight. It was forged from years of scars that had stacked quietly, one atop the other, until they hardened into something far less fragile than she imagined. To understand why I didn't shatter when she walked away, you'd have to understand the ways she had been walking away for years. Piece by piece, long before the paperwork ever existed. There was a time when we had been in love, or at least in something that looked close enough to it that I believed, wholeheartedly, it could weather anything. In the early days, we laughed easily, dreamed loudly, held each other like the world could end tomorrow. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, those days faded. It began with small things, a sarcastic jab disguised as humor, a dismissal of my ideas when I spoke about the future, a lack of interest in the small victories I brought home. At first, I ignored them, excused them even, telling myself she was tired, distracted, stressed. But then came the sharper cuts. I remember a dinner years back with friends, when I shared an idea I had been working on, a side project I'd poured weeks into, something that mattered to me, and she laughed, not kindly but cruelly, right there at the table. "You and your little projects," she sneered, and though others chuckled nervously, I felt the burn of humiliation sink deep. That was the first time I realized she didn't just doubt me in private. She wanted others to doubt me too. It didn't stop there. Over time, she began keeping score in ways I couldn't win. My successes were minimized, my failures magnified, and my very presence often felt like an inconvenience in her carefully constructed image of herself. She would dress to perfection when stepping out into the world, soaking up admiration, but at home, her eyes carried nothing but disdain when they landed on me. It wasn't just emotional neglect. It was erosion, a steady wearing away of dignity that made me question whether I was enough, whether I was capable, whether I was even truly seen by the woman I had chosen. And the cruelest part was that she seemed to enjoy it. The way her smile lingered when I faltered, the way her tone sharpened when others could hear, the way she reminded me, subtly but persistently, that without her I was ordinary. I carried those wounds quietly, pressing them down beneath layers of endurance, convincing myself that love meant patience, that loyalty meant silence, that marriage meant weathering storms no matter how brutal. But those past wounds weren't wasted. They became the blueprint of my resilience. Every cruel word, every mocking glance, every dismissive laugh hardened me in ways she couldn't see, preparing me for the day she finally said the word she thought would break me. She believed divorce would leave me hollow. What she never realized was that she had already hollowed me out long before. And what was left was not fragile, it was tempered steel, yet those wounds also revealed something more insidious: the lies she told herself to maintain her facade. She carried herself as though she were the prize, the centerpiece, the one keeping our marriage alive through her supposed patience with me. She told friends how difficult it was to be with someone who lacked ambition, someone too ordinary for her extraordinary tastes, and though I never confronted her directly, the whispers always found me. For a time, I believed them. I began to question my worth, to shrink into myself, to measure my successes against the impossible standards she set not to uplift me, but to crush me. That self-doubt nearly consumed me until I began to see the cracks in her own armor. For all her mockery, for all her insistence that I was less, she was terrified of being unseen. Every cruel word she threw at me was less about my failures and more about her fear that without someone to diminish, she had no shine of her own. Once I recognized that, everything changed. The cruelty no longer cut as deeply. Instead, it exposed her weakness, her desperation, her reliance on dragging others down to feel elevated. That understanding was my turning point, long before the divorce papers. I realized that love had long since left our marriage, replaced by a performance in which I was cast as the inferior half and she, the long-suffering heroine. And in recognizing that performance for what it was, I stopped playing my role. I stopped apologizing for existing, stopped trying to mold myself into the image she demanded, stopped letting her words define me. That shift was subtle at first. I spoke less, reacted less, let her jabs bounce off me like rain on stone, but it rattled her. She thrived on reaction, on validation of her cruelty, and my silence denied her that. By the time she filed for divorce, she thought she was delivering the final blow, but the truth was that the war had ended long before she picked up a pen. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that the very wounds she left behind had planted the seeds of my transformation. Because while she believed she had broken me, what she had actually done was prepare me. And soon enough, when she saw the woman who replaced her, she would realize that every jab, every insult, every attempt to diminish me had built the very man who could move on without her. What do you think hurts more, losing love or watching the one you left rise without you? Share your thoughts. After weeks of whispers and her curated performance of freedom, I began to shift in ways neither she nor anyone else anticipated. It wasn't deliberate at first. It started with small changes, almost accidental acts of reclaiming space in a life that had long felt suffocating. I began to wake earlier, not because I couldn't sleep, but because the dawn felt like mine again, untouched by her scorn. I returned to habits I had abandoned, long runs that punished my lungs but cleared my head. Books I had once set aside because she mocked them as impractical, quiet evenings of planning, building, working on myself in silence. Each step felt like dusting off fragments of the man I had once been, the man she had tried to bury beneath years of contempt. With every passing day, my body grew stronger, my mind sharper, my sense of direction clearer. I invested time into my career with a focus that startled colleagues. Projects that once felt burdensome now became opportunities, and the energy I had once wasted on enduring her cruelty fueled a new determination to rise. People noticed. At work, where pity had once colored their glances, respect began to take its place. Conversations shifted from whispered condolences about my failed marriage to genuine curiosity about what I was building next. Even old friends, the kind who had drifted away during the storm of my marriage, reached out again, drawn by the change they could sense even from a distance. I didn't flaunt it. I didn't post pictures or make speeches about reinventing myself. I let the work, the presence, the quiet dignity of my transformation speak for itself. And yet, it carried louder than any announcement could. The man who was supposed to collapse had not only survived, he was ascending. The irony was that her attempts to define me as weak had forged the strength she never expected, and the very act of walking away had set me free to become the man she had always feared. I might be one who no longer needed her validation, her permission, her presence, but the transformation was not mine alone to witness. It was hers too. And that was where the true shift began. For as much as she paraded her new life, as much as she painted herself as liberated, the glow she wore in public began to dim when she realized that I was not playing the part she had written for me. At a mutual acquaintance's birthday, weeks after the papers had been filed, she walked in radiant, expecting to find me diminished, but instead her eyes landed on someone unrecognizable. My posture had changed, my suit fit better, my smile was unforced, my conversation confident. I wasn't hiding in the corner nursing pity. I was in the center, laughing easily, engaging fully, not as a man trying to prove himself, but as a man who had nothing left to prove. I watched the flicker in her gaze, that quick, involuntary narrowing of her eyes, the tightening of her jaw, and I knew it rattled her more than any words could, because she had told herself the story of my collapse so many times that seeing me rise disrupted her entire narrative. The more she saw of me, the more the control she thought she held slipped away. Friends who once indulged her tales of endurance began to shift their sympathies, their eyes lingering on me with respect and on her with quiet skepticism. The whispers that had once painted me as the broken man now murmured about her cruelty, her haste, her miscalculation. She noticed the shift, and it ate at her. I didn't need to confront her. My existence was confrontation enough. My transformation was the mirror she couldn't escape, and in it she saw not just me becoming more but herself becoming less. And while she struggled to maintain the image of the woman who had moved on, the cracks in her facade widened. She had expected me to be a ghost trailing behind her triumph. Instead, I was the storm on the horizon, gathering strength silently, inevitably. She tried to claw back control in subtle ways. Messages through mutual friends, little comments slipped into conversations, suggestions that I was changing too quickly, but it was too late. The balance had shifted. And when the time came to reveal the woman who had stepped into the space she thought she would forever own, the transformation would not just shock her. It would undo her. By the time spring rolled in, the rhythms of my life no longer resembled the hollow routines of the months before. Where silence and shame once clung like smoke, there was now momentum, purpose, and an energy that startled even me in its intensity. I had stepped into circles I never would have imagined months earlier, drawn into opportunities that came not because I sought attention but because attention now sought me. Work flourished, not just the grind of 9 to 5, but projects that carried weight, initiatives that demanded presence, and invitations to places where voices shaped futures. My health, sharpened by discipline, showed in the way I carried myself, and strangers noticed what friends whispered. I had become something different. And alongside that growth, in the quiet moments away from public eyes, another presence entered my life, one whose arrival shifted the very foundation of everything my ex-wife thought she had claimed. It began innocently, almost quietly, the way real change always does. A chance conversation at a professional event, a shared glance over the clink of glasses, a smile that carried warmth without pretense. She wasn't someone loud or seeking attention. She was someone whose gravity pulled you without effort, someone whose presence felt like calm waters after years of storms. Where my ex-wife had mocked, she listened. Where my ex-wife had competed, she encouraged. Where my ex-wife had diminished, she magnified. At first, I told myself it was nothing, that after everything I had endured, I couldn't risk rushing into anything resembling intimacy. But the truth is, her steadiness disarmed me. We spoke more, slowly at first, then often, until the conversations themselves became a rhythm as natural as breathing. She never once asked about the divorce. She didn't prod at wounds, didn't demand explanations. She saw me as I was, not as I had been reduced to, and that alone was enough to draw me toward her. For the first time in years, I laughed without the echo of cruelty. I spoke without the weight of judgment. I stood without bracing for mockery. And as those weeks turned into months, it became clear. This wasn't a rebound, wasn't an escape. This was a beginning. A beginning I hadn't expected, but one I couldn't deny. And then, inevitably, the worlds collided. Invitations don't wait for permission, and life has a way of pulling you into stages you didn't plan to step onto. The first time I brought her into a public space that overlapped with the remnants of my past, The atmosphere shifted like a storm front sweeping through a quiet town. It was a charity gala, one of those glittering affairs my ex-wife had once lived for, and though I considered declining, I knew that avoiding it would only feed the narrative she had spun, that she walked away shining, and I hid in her shadow. So I went, and I didn't go alone. From the moment we entered the room, I felt the air tighten, eyes snapping toward us, whispers igniting like sparks in dry grass. My ex-wife was there, of course, draped in a gown designed to remind the world of her relevance. Her laughter pitched too brightly, her circle of admirers orbiting like satellites around a dying star. She saw me almost instantly. I could tell from the way her smile froze mid-sentence, from the way her fingers tightened imperceptibly around her glass. And then her gaze slid to the woman at my side, the woman she had never anticipated, never prepared for. Murmurs rippled through the room, the kind of whispers that carry more weight than shouts, and I could feel every pair of eyes shifting, not just to me but to her. My new beginning wasn't loud, wasn't gaudy, wasn't a performance. She carried herself with the kind of grace that silenced rooms, the kind of presence that made excess look desperate. And in that moment I knew the story was no longer about me being left behind. The story had become about who I had chosen to walk beside me now. My ex-wife's lips parted, her expression flickering between disbelief and fury, her carefully built facade cracking like glass under too much pressure. But before she could react, before anyone could fill the silence with their conclusions, I leaned just slightly toward the woman beside me, and together we stepped fully into the light of the room. The reveal had come, and it was only the beginning of her undoing. When she froze at my new beginning, the tables turned. If you were me, what would you have said to her? Drop it in the comments. The days following that gala carried a weight that no one could ignore. What had been a single evening of glitter and whispers quickly spread like wildfire through every corner of the social and professional circles we once shared, mutating into a story that people retold with relish. To them, it wasn't just another event. It was a spectacle, the kind that cemented reputations and destroyed facades. Everywhere I went, I could feel the ripple of it, the way conversations shifted when I entered the room, the way eyes lingered just a little too long, curious, measuring, comparing. Some came up to me directly, their voices dripping with admiration masked as casual small talk. "You seemed different that night," they'd say, or, "She really didn't see that coming, did she?" Others stayed silent but couldn't hide the glint of intrigue in their expressions. But none of it compared to the storm brewing behind her polished exterior. My ex-wife had spent months weaving a narrative in which she was the heroine escaping an unworthy man, a narrative her admirers had eagerly accepted because it was easy to believe. That night shattered the illusion. For all her posturing, all her careful control, she had been undone by something as simple as my composure and the presence of a woman who carried herself with grace she could never mimic. I knew it because I saw it in her eyes that night, saw the fury hiding beneath the trembling smile she forced onto her face. And I knew it because the very next day, the whispers shifted from me to her. No longer was I the man abandoned, pitied, left to pick up pieces. I was the man who had risen, who had been chosen, who had shown strength in silence. She, on the other hand, became the one people questioned. Why did she really leave? They asked. How could she walk away from him and end up here? In the cruel economy of social standing, her stock plummeted overnight. And though I didn't take pleasure in her unraveling, I also didn't deny the quiet satisfaction of justice finally tipping the scale. Her response was as predictable as it was desperate. She tried to claw her way back into relevance, hosting lavish dinners, posting curated glimpses of her life online, surrounding herself with anyone willing to orbit her fading star. But the harder she tried, the clearer it became that her efforts reeked of desperation. People noticed the cracks in her laughter, the sharpness behind her smiles, the bitterness in her tone when my name surfaced, which it often did. For though she tried to pretend I was irrelevant, she couldn't escape the fact that I had become the measure by which she was now judged. At gatherings, I caught her eyes darting toward me and the woman at my side, her mask slipping whenever she thought no one was watching. And yet she couldn't resist approaching, testing the waters with veiled comments. "You've changed," she remarked once, her tone balanced precariously between accusation and admiration. Funny how people reinvent themselves so quickly, but her words lacked bite, because everyone listening knew reinvention wasn't the whole truth. This wasn't reinvention. This was revelation, the man I had always been beneath her shadow finally visible. And the more she tried to discredit it, the more people saw through her bitterness. The new woman in my life didn't need to defend me. Her very presence, her quiet confidence, was enough. She represented everything my ex-wife had claimed I could never attract. And in doing so, she exposed how deeply my ex-wife had misjudged me. That realization, I think, wounded her more than any humiliation at the gala. Because it wasn't just that I had moved on, it was who I had moved on with. It was the undeniable proof that she hadn't left a man beneath her but had walked away from a man rising higher than she could ever reach. And as much as she tried to fight it, as much as she tried to rewrite the story, the truth lingered in every whisper, in every glance, in every comparison that left her smaller and me stronger. In the months that followed, the story of our divorce ceased to belong to either of us. It belonged to the whispers, to the collective memory of those who had watched it unfold like an opera staged before their eyes. Yet, unlike most spectacles that fade with time, this one seemed to grow sharper in recollection. People remembered the way she had declared her liberation with such arrogance, and they remembered the way she had stood frozen at the gala when confronted with the reality of what she had lost. That image became legend, retold with subtle embellishments each time, until her name was no longer associated with triumph but with miscalculation. She had wanted to be remembered as the woman who rose above, but instead she was etched into memory as the woman who underestimated the man she left behind. For me, life moved forward with a steadiness I had not felt in years. The whispers, the pity, the gossip, all of it faded into irrelevance as the world adjusted to the truth of who I had become. My days were filled with purpose, my nights with peace, and my moments with a woman whose presence reminded me daily that dignity is not something granted by others but something carried within. She didn't just stand beside me. She elevated me in ways my ex-wife could never understand because she did not see love as competition but as partnership. Together we walked into rooms that once felt suffocating and turned them into stages of quiet victory. Not by flaunting our connection, but by existing in it naturally, without apology. And each time my ex-wife caught sight of us, whether at an event or in the periphery of mutual circles, I could see the weight of her regret pressing heavier on her shoulders. She had gambled on the belief that I was ordinary, and the gamble had failed spectacularly. The legacy of her choice was written not in the papers she filed, but in the life I built afterward. A life that proved she had never truly known the man she married, but the deeper legacy was not in her downfall or even in my rise. It was in the lesson carved into me through the fire of betrayal and the slow rebirth that followed. I learned that silence is not weakness, that endurance is not surrender, and that sometimes the most devastating losses are the very catalysts for transformation. She had tried to define me by absence, by stripping away the roles and titles that once tethered me to her. But in doing so, she freed me to step fully into myself. I no longer carried bitterness toward her, though she mistook my indifference for cruelty. The truth is, she had become irrelevant to the story of my life long before she realized it. Her downfall, her regret, her attempts to claw back dignity, none of it mattered to me anymore. What mattered was the freedom to stand tall without apology, to love without fear, to exist without the constant weight of someone else's contempt. And so, when I looked back on everything, the years of wounds, the night of the divorce, the whispers, the reveal, I did not see a tragedy. I saw liberation disguised as betrayal. The world had seen a woman file for divorce and a man left behind. What they never expected, and what she least of all could fathom, was that the man left behind would become the man beyond her reach. That was the legacy of it all, not that she demanded a divorce, but that she never expected who would take her place, and that knowledge would haunt her far longer than any papers, any whispers, or any stage smiles ever could. And that's how the story ends, not with the divorce papers she thought would define me, but with the regret she never saw coming. If you made it this far, you already know the twists don't stop here. More stories like this are waiting for you, each one filled with betrayal, transformation, and unforgettable endings. Make sure you subscribe to Fractured Promises so you never miss what's next. And tell me in the comments, if you were in my place, what would you have done when she came back? I read every reply and I want to hear yours. Until the next story. Stay strong, stay watching, and remember, every ending is just the start of something else.